Buddy, thank you so much for joining. My name is Pat Bulmer. I'm a partner and co-founder at Halo Consulting, certified minority-owned search firm. We bring the process-oriented best practices of global executive search firms to startups and pre-IPO tech companies. Halo hosts virtual roundtable events like this one as part of our live podcast series, where we invite a variety of HR leaders to speak on a wide range of topics, and hope you'll be interested in attending our future events as well. This event is being recorded. Everybody will receive an email with a link to the recording. Feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar, and we'll address those questions at the end of the webinar. We'll also share the slide deck after this that you'll be seeing shared on the screen, and we'll send a survey to everybody just to get feedback afterwards. Today, we're joined by a great group of passionate TA leaders, and without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our panel. First up, I'd like to introduce Michelle Howard, Diversity and Inclusion Director at Vizient. Michelle is the DEI Director at Vizient, the nation's largest healthcare performance improvement company. Michelle has over a decade of learning and organizational development experience and led sales and sales training organizations earlier in her career. Thank you for joining, Michelle.
Absolutely.
Our next panelist, Brittany Kamson. Brittany is a campus recruiter at Atlassian, the global software company behind team collaboration software like Jira, Confluence, and Trello, where she focuses on recruiting technical talent. Brittany started her career in sales at talent acquisition at Closer IQ and EF College Study Tours. Very happy to have you, Brittany.
Thanks for having me.
And our final panelist, Nick Ingram, Director of Search Operations and Organizational Development right here at Halo Consulting. Nick began his career as a generalist recruiter at the executive search firms Jobplex and DHR International, promoted 3 times in 4 years, supporting the book of business of Jobplex president and HR executive search lead, before leading the operations for that business and ultimately joining Halo Consulting in 2020. Nick oversees the creation and development of processes, procedures, and best practices for internal hiring and interviewing here at Halo, as well as externally for our startup clients. Excited to have you, Nick.
Thanks for including me, Patrick.
Okay, so we will dive right in. And Michelle, the first question we'll ask you to kick off, and just to frame up the conversation, what does bias mean in an interview context?
I thought about answering this question several ways, and instead of giving you the textbook definition, I'm going to take a few seconds and walk you through a scenario and show you what bias is. So I want everyone to close your eyes if you dare. If not, I'm going to give you a few examples or scenarios to walk through, and I just want you to picture them in your head. You are at the beach, you are walking down the beach, you see a family with a young child playing, enjoying their vacation. Next scenario. You are on an airplane where the pilot actually comes out and thanks you directly for joining the flight. You are, the next scenario, you are at an award ceremony where CEOs across the nation are being recognized for running the top performing companies across the nation. Now, I want you to open your eyes. And I want to ask you a few questions. Number 1, did you see yourself in any one of those scenarios? Just think about it. Number 2, did you see anyone that looked like you in any of the scenarios? Number 3, did the person or people that you pictured in the scenario, why did you picture that person? Is it because what you're used to seeing? Is it because what you saw last? Is it because you see that person being successful based on your lived experiences? Or is it because you just decided to put that person in that scenario, which we all know is not the case? And some of you are having moments of, wait a minute, why didn't I picture myself? Or wait a minute, why did I picture myself in every single one of the scenarios? Or even, why did I picture who I pictured in the scenarios? If you had a family, did you picture your family in the scenario? So With that being said, bias, positive or negative, because it can be both, is simply an inclination or preference that interferes or is impartial to judgment. What we want to make sure is that we're not using our bias in a negative way. We're not using our bias to stop success. We're using our bias when we can to promote success. So everyone has bias. The key is to be aware of it and not allow it to impact your decisions or your work, especially from an interview perspective, negatively. Thank you.
Really appreciate that insight, and a powerful exercise as well. Michelle and also the other panelists, what tools or resources or processes do you see the best interviewers use to be proactive in eliminating their own biases?
So I'll start off very quickly. It's something called the ladder of inference that a lot of people aren't aware of. And it's a process of thinking that we go through that we don't realize we're going through it, which in turn is why it becomes dangerous, because we want to go through life making sure we're aware and in control of how we process information. The ladder of inference allows you to take a group of data, you pull the amount of data that you want to choose to either impact how you walk through life or impact how you place judgment on other people. And the scenario that I use quite some time is, have you ever gone somewhere and you keep getting red lights, and you come up with this entire message of anytime you're going somewhere important, you're going to catch every single red light there is. Do you take in consideration the number of green lights you hit? Do you take in consideration the number of yellow lights that you maybe ran through? The point is, are you taking in all of the information needed to make successful decisions based on whatever's going on, and not just using what may support your negative message that you pulled out of a large piece of data? Ladder of inference. Get very familiar with it.
The ladder of inference, that's a great starting point for us, I think. So appreciate that, Michelle. And Michelle, one more for you. What are some of the major or most common biases that interviewers exhibit, even if subconsciously?
So there are 7 common, and most of them are subconscious, to be completely honest with you, but it's appearance bias. And before I name all of them, you may not have heard one in the past, but it's similar to something that you've already, so there's different names, but here's the basics. The appearance bias, halo bias, horns bias, the opposite of halo horns, recency bias, generational bias, familiar bias or similar bias, and then last, location or geographic bias. Those are the top 7.
I appreciate that. I think being aware of what those are is the first step to eliminating them. And just to recap for everyone, that's appearance, halo, horns, recency bias, generational bias, familiarity bias, and then location or geographic bias. Nick, next question, would love to have you start off. Where do you start when implementing an interview process and you're thinking about building one that is going to eliminate as many of those biases as possible? Where does somebody start?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And I actually want to go back real quick to some of the biases that Michelle had called out, just to unpack them a little bit, because I don't know if some of our viewers or listeners are familiar with some of those terms. I just want to call out a few that might be more unfamiliar. Probably familiar with like a generational bias or geography bias. If somebody comes from our geography, we feel some sort of connection to that person. The same thing with familiar. If we knew somebody from a previous employer or something like that, we could have some sort of bias one way or the other towards that candidate. But some of the others, like halo or horns or recency, I noticed might be less well known to interviewers. And so halo, just not to confuse it with our brand, Patrick, But Halo would be a situation where you're talking to a candidate and maybe it isn't going so well, but one thing you really like about that person's background, and that stands out and ends up seeping into and overtaking how you're evaluating that candidate as a whole and biases the whole evaluation of that individual. And the same thing happens with horns, as Michelle mentioned. Some call it negative emphasis. So it's like one aspect of a person's background clouds the rest of the person's interview. And so I got one more actually additional bias I wanted to add on, Patrick, if I may, which is confirmation bias. It kind of aligns to a few of the ones that Michelle had mentioned too, but this ties into a lot of what I'll be talking about on this panel, which has to do with process and structure. So confirmation bias in an interview context would be when you are leading a candidate to a specific answer, or asking a question in a way that seems to confirm a preconceived notion about that person. It could even be something that seems so innocent as saying, you crushed your 2021 revenue quota, if you're talking to a sales individual. You must have grinded out long hours, huh? So you're kind of putting that person beyond just using masculine language, by the way, which can ostracize the person that you're speaking to, can really put that person in a situation where now they feel like they need to respond in a certain way, and actually puts them perhaps, even though they think at an advantage, could be at a disadvantage. So what I'm going to be touching on a lot of is asking open-ended questions that are mostly confined to a competency that you're trying to assess. And I'm going to return to this throughout. So to answer your question, Patrick, about where do you start when implementing an interview process to eliminate bias, a few things. One, you can start with creating a competency model and scorecard. So I'm not going to unpack exactly what a competency model is or how to put it together. We don't have the time. But essentially, you identify some core competencies or traits or attributes or skills that are consistent across your enterprise. And it helps to identify what we often call like the culture piece of our organization. And culture is in the work context. And when you're interviewing a candidate, the culture you're thinking about isn't, do I want to get a beer with this person after work? It's how I want to be interacting with person during work. And so when you create a competency model, you've identified what those core attributes or skills are. And at Halo, I think we have about 6 or 7 or something, Patrick. We identify what those core competencies are, what's true to every Halo employee, and then we formulate about 3 or 4 questions per competency that we're going to ask every single interviewee. So when we think about what are the qualities of an effective interview process that can help eliminate bias as much as possible, we have a process that's measurable. So we're using a competency scorecard. We're rating candidates based on their response to each question on a scale. I think for us, we use 0 to 3. It's equitable. So each candidate goes through the same process. They're evaluated the same way. They're asked the same questions. And it's streamlined. So it keeps everybody who's interviewing this individual on the same page. The other nice thing about competencies, and I know, Patrick, we're going to talk a little bit later about experience versus competency and how, leaning too much on experience can influence an interviewer's bias, perhaps in the process. If you're emphasizing someone's potential to do well in a role, rather than on previous experience at a certain company or a certain industry. It also allows you to take a deeper dive into where candidates fall short. So another bias I was going to bring up, Patrick, was contrast bias, where you might talk to one candidate the beginning part of the day and another candidate later on. And the first interview you had with candidate A, they might have lacked energy during the interview process, but might have been very well qualified. And later in the day, you talk to candidate B, where maybe they had a lot more energy, but they weren't as qualified. And the sort of combination of recency bias and also comparing candidate B to candidate A clouds how candidate B and candidate A actually compare to the job itself. So when we're hiring individuals, we're hiring candidates against job requirements, not against a gut feeling or even compared to other candidates. But a competency model will allow you to unpack exactly where candidate A and candidate B have strengths and where they fall short.
Really appreciate that, Nick. Brittany, any thoughts to add on this one?
Yeah, and I really appreciate how thorough that was, Nick, and also kudos to Michelle. Like the beginning of that exercise was just, again, a good reminder that we all have bias constantly, and it's something that we are consistently trying to make sure that it is positive and working towards being as inclusive as possible. One thing I will add to eliminating bias when you're implementing an interview process is that it's from the get-go and it's consistent. So when you are creating a job description, that is immediately where bias can come into play. And like you were saying, Nick, like language used is really, really important because that can make roles or jobs exclusionary and can make women, people of color, veterans, folks with disabilities decide, oh, I'm not qualified for a role, I won't apply for it. And so I think it's really important to remember that bias is going to come in throughout the interview process at every single stage, and you have to be really aware of it and also have checkpoints, have other people within your organization who can help you and assist you and be that, verifier for you sometimes to make sure like, hey, is this language as inclusive as possible? But what's also amazing is that there are so many tools and software that you can implement that helps you through this, that people have created and are trained to really make sure job descriptions are as inclusive as possible. The questions that you're asking are focused, like Nick said, on competencies. And that you are being as inclusive as possible in your debriefs as well. I think debriefs are also an area that a lot of bias can come up. And I think it's just really important, again, to be as aware as possible, but also to really empathize with candidates and with their experiences, because your bias is based off of your experience, your background, your environment, and realizing that other people that you're talking to, even your teams, your hiring managers, all have a different perspective and a different background that informs how they show up is just important to constantly remember, empathize towards, and make sure you're aware of in your interview process.
I appreciate all those responses from everyone. Nick, how do you approach panel interviews versus individual one-on-one interviews? And how does the format of the interview itself impact the biases that the interviewers bring?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Brittany was really starting to hit the nail on the head talking about the debriefs and how individuals who are part of the interview process talk to one another about a candidate. And that really gets to panel versus one-on-one and kind of making sure that you're keeping people true and keeping people honest. I want to take a step back here for a second because I said a lot in my last response and talking about competency models and scorecards. And I think when people who are not in HR or not in DEI or not in talent acquisition hear scorecard, they see it as a bit of a bad word and maybe adding too much rigidity and process to what should be a little bit more conversational. And when we talk about scorecards at Halo, when we use those as part of our internal interview process, it's only one portion of the entire process. So what we have is our core competency model. Let's say we have 6 different competencies. It's grit, it's leadership, it's critical thinking, those kinds of things. And we ask 2 to 3 questions per competency. And we divide those competencies among 3 different interviewers. So we know exactly who's covering what and not overlapping. They're though required to ask those questions exactly how they're worded. They're required to rank the candidate on a scale. And then they're required also to add some notes to justify their response. And again, that sounds like a lot of process, but once you ask those questions, you've done your duty, and then you can ask some any kind of other follow-up questions that you have about the candidate's background. But it's those core competencies that keep the interviewers true to what it is that exactly they're looking for and what we think it means to be a Halo employee. So I just wanted to call that out at first. But when we talk about panel interviews versus individual one-on-one, there are kind of 3 different ways you can approach this. And the traditional way is interviewing people one person at a time. And that's fine. The pro, of course, it allows you to screen out candidates who are not a fit before other people speak to the candidate. So it saves you a lot of time. It also, I think, when you have first interviews with a hiring manager, it can help form deeper relationships between the candidate and the interviewer. The con to this, though, is that you lose collaboration, you lose perspective, and you lose accountability as well. So on the flip side, you have panel interviews. If any of you have been through those before, as a candidate, they're very strange to navigate. But the pros from the interviewer side is that it allows you to deliberate and gain different perspectives and opinions from the other panelists who are interviewing the same person at the same time when you're debriefing. And unlike the one-on-one interviews, if one person has a misunderstanding with a candidate, it doesn't bring the entire candidate's candidacy down with it. You know, it's hard to sort of audit somebody on their bias, if you will, if it's a one-on-one interview and you don't have somebody else in the room, you know, offering up an alternative opinion to what they were seeing versus what someone else was seeing. And I know, Michelle, you talk about lenses that we view other people, and you know, if you ask 10 different people to give their opinion about whatever it is that they're looking at, I know you have a specific example. I don't mean to step on your toes, but 9 out of 10 times you're going to get a different response. So at Halo, we have what's we call like an interview loop, which is actually language I think Amazon uses for their interview process. And what that means is we have a candidate that once they've gone through an initial screen and they're going to be kind of going through the full interview process, they will guaranteed to talk to one person at a time, but through a full interview loop. Let's say it's 3 different people dividing up those competencies. So the pros there is that it splits the difference between a one-on-one and a panel interview and allows you to deliberate and gain different perspectives and opinions. So at Halo, Patrick might be talking to a candidate first. I'll talk to a candidate second. Another colleague will talk to a candidate third, each one of us doing so one-on-one. And then after we've written down our scores for the individual and justified our opinions for why we like the candidate or don't, we get together and we deliberate. So it's a way to hold each other accountable. Yeah.
Brittany and Michelle, any thoughts you'd like to add on the format of interviews before we move on to our next question?
I think that Nick, you're right on the mark with what some of my counterparts and I do when we think our bias might be showing up. We will cross-reference. Hey, I think that I might be partial to this person. I'm not even going to tell you why, but can you meet with them and give me your feedback? And that individually, that will kind of cross-reference whether your bias showed up. And if it did it impact the interviewer's journey negatively? Because remember, bias can be positive or it can be negative. So that's something that we do quite often. And we purposely don't tell each other what we think the bias is that may be showing up, because that's a bias in itself and may impact that experience.
I really appreciate that. Moving on to our next question, one for everybody. Brittany, maybe we can start with you. How do you ensure a consistent candidate experience throughout the entire interview process?
Yeah, so I am a big fan of creating consistency through templates, through resources, through websites and tools. I think it's really important to make sure that you are giving every single candidate the best possible shot at doing well through an interview process, knowing that some folks might have mock interview training, might have resume review resources. And if you can provide anything to help make sure everybody is coming at the same line and same perspective in the interview process, that's really important. I am very fortunate in the campus side that we work at such a high volume that we've really mastered the art of creating resources so that all candidates have the same information, know what, the STAR interview method is, know how to do well on a HackerRank and skills assessment, know what questions to prepare for. We just want to make sure that everybody is as set as possible when they're coming to an interview. And so I think it's really important to lean into any sort of templates or any sort of consistent resources and interview prep that you can provide to all of your candidates so that everyone is getting the same experience. And then also making sure that you can, and I know we'll get into this later, but you get feedback from everybody and you're able to then use that feedback to adjust the content and adjust the resources so that everybody is, somebody says like, hey, I didn't feel as prepared for this. You can take that, use that, and then adjust accordingly. So anything that you can do to make sure everyone's on an equal playing field, I think is really important to reduce just any potential bias through that process. But yeah.
And Nick or Michelle, any thoughts to add?
I'd love to jump in, but Michelle, if you have any thoughts.
It's like double Dutch. I'm like, wait, is it? I want to add one tiny little piece. And I'm always, or I typically come from a DEIB. And what I mean by that, it's not just about diversity and inclusion, it's about equity and belonging. And we have worked so hard to make things equal. And sometimes we get stuck there that we don't get to the belonging. And the belonging in DEIB is not just making sure they have a seat at the table, but it's making sure that if they need their chair raised a little bit, that we have that function for them. Or if they need, for us short people, you can't tell, but I'm a shorty. For us short people, is the table going to be up to our nose? Do we have a step stool or whatever it needs to be? And that equity piece is what takes it to the next level. And that's when we're able to uncover talent that we wouldn't normally be able to uncover. I'll give you a perfect example. Everybody needs to know your peak time. If you don't know it, you need to go figure out what it is. Mine is that 10 to 12, and look at the time that we're in. 10 to 12 is the time where I am going to be at my best. That needs to be the time that I interview with other companies, period. And if you can't get me in that space, guess what? You're not going to get the best of me. And that's the difference between being between using, and this goes both ways as an interviewer and as an interviewee, making sure, and what I love to ask, what is in a perfect world, because everybody doesn't know what peak time is, or, they don't understand how to use that term in the interview space, but in a perfect world, what time would you have this interview? Not, are you available at this time? Because we want the best of the best, right? We're not interviewing to get mediocre, we're interviewing to get the best of the best. And that's how you take it a step further, by simply giving that one piece of, that one tool. So if we think about, okay, we've got everybody at this table, but does everybody feel like they belong at the table? And if we made them feel like they belong, how would this experience be different?
Michelle, I love that you added that. And I think practically for folks who are recruiters or in talent acquisition, it's really easy to ask, do you need any accommodations? Like, how can we help support you through the interview process so you are as best prepared to take this on as possible? And yeah, just very glad that you highlighted that, because that's another part of it.
Simple question, Brittany, simple question. And it just gave me chills because it's so powerful. And you would not believe the amount of power that it gives people and the extra miles that they will go for you because of that. Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah, and thank you both. Brittany hitting the nail on the head in terms of process and preparation. And I think that feeds really well into the belonging piece that Michelle's talking about. A lot of times when we are interviewing candidates, we're in this sort of position of authority and this position of power. And especially if you're not used to it, you can maybe abuse it. And I think we get into this attitude where the individual we're talking to, no matter what their background is, feel that they should be grateful that they're interviewing at your organization and with you, and that they have your time, when in fact we ask candidates to do their homework on us, and we roll in 5 minutes before we just wrapped up a meeting. We haven't done any prep. We've just looking at the resume for the first time, and we're asking the same 5, 6, 7 questions that the person before them did. And so I think, what Brittany's saying about preparation is huge, especially if you're on the HR, DEI, DEIB, and talent acquisition side, is you need to prepare your hiring managers for the interview out of a sense of, we need to show this person that we're walking the walk when it comes to our culture, especially if we're saying that we are an inclusive organization. We want people to feel like they belong. So it's a simple thing like prepping your hiring managers with a few bullet points about the person's background, making sure they have a few minutes prior to review the resume, giving them kind of a brief overview of the person. And I want to be clear about what you're briefing them on. You're not briefing the interviewer on the opinions that you have about the candidate. You're briefing them about facts, things that you can measure, or outcomes, or something that came up during the interview process or the screening process that you can point to that aren't going to cloud that person's opinion of the individual, other than their own. From what comes out of the interview process. And again, that comes out of the preparation. I think another good thing when it comes to process, and to ensure like there's a consistent candidate experience, is like, time is everything too. And a great way to move candidates through the process timing wise, while also ensuring that you're not clouding someone's opinion of a candidate through bias, is making sure that your interviewers have time allotted afterwards, like make it mandatory for them 10 minutes to clean up their notes, write up their notes, and put it away, so that, if they interview other people throughout the day, they can go back to their notes and remember exactly how they felt about that person, and it not be clouded by the other conversations that they've had with other candidates or with other panelists when they're debriefing as a whole. So when you're doing that, you're creating a bit of speed as well, creating an efficiency in your process. And I would also say commit to a timeline for next steps with the candidate. Make sure that, especially if you're on the talent acquisition side, put a time limit on how long you have before you need to give a candidate an update on if they're moving forward. This is, of course, an ideal situation, because it shows the candidate that your organization is capable of making decisions. They know exactly when they can expect to hear back from you. And it also allows you to compete against competing employers. It keeps you honest. It keeps you on that timeline. And so therefore, you'd also debrief on a timely manner as well. So those are the things I would add.
Really great to hear all this insight, and a lot of these are very simple and actionable suggestions if you really are proactive about eliminating interview bias from your process. There are a lot of easy, straightforward ways to start, and I think everybody's doing a great job of calling those out. We'd love to hear from everybody, and maybe Brittany, we'll start with you on what tools do you use to measure the candidate experience?
Yeah, so as an organization where I work at Atlassian, we have a whole candidate experience team, which just helps have real focus on the candidate experience, making sure that we have, a survey that's sent out. We have a team that's sending those surveys out, consolidating the feedback and getting it together to then share with the rest of the organization. I know not every, organization has the capability to create a whole team, especially if you are a startup. So I think the easiest thing you can do is just create a survey, a Google form, and ask questions that you send out to all of your candidates ideally, but especially candidates that go through your entire interview process, to understand, did they feel prepared? What additional information would they have liked to see? How did they feel like they were treated throughout the process? Did they feel like they got enough feedback and information to help them do better in the next step of the process? Asking really straightforward questions to get as much information as possible to help inform your team on, one, how that interview process went and how the candidate experience was, but then also how you can use that information to improve and make sure that the process is consistent, is as equitable as possible, and is accommodating everyone as much as possible too, to make it better in the future.
Nick or Michelle, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, happy to jump in. I think those sort of post-interview surveys are really key to getting a sense of who your audience is. And, you know, interviews are not just about evaluation, but it's about employer brand as well. And I know at Halo, what we do for our own searches that we conduct for our clients is we want to know how we did on the front end, which is actually, you know, pretty key to creating a diversified slate. And so we'll send post-search candidate surveys to every candidate that reached, you know, our client interview to know a little bit about them, you know, some demographic pieces of information, and we try to get as detailed with that as possible and see if we have some trends that we can then look back on, assess, and take action accordingly.
I'm going to tag team that. I cannot stress enough how important it is from a cultural and engagement perspective. How you think you're viewed and how you're actually viewed is sometimes two totally different things. So once you understand how you want to be viewed from an organizational perspective and from an org effectiveness perspective, you need to make sure that that's really happening. So those candidate experience surveys are gold. And that goes to not just the candidates that you've brought into the company, but all of the candidates that you've interviewed. That feedback is going to let you know whether you're doing what you think you're doing. And if you're not, it's going to show you exactly where you need to improve. So I can't speak enough on that. I'm so glad that Brittany started this conversation off with that piece, because if I could only say one thing, that would be it. And not to do it on a level 1 or level 2. You know, you've got level 1, 2, 3, 4 basic survey questions. You don't want level 1 and level 2 questions on that survey. You want to know not just if we did a good job. You want to know why we did a good job. We want to know if you walked away with a negative experience, what exactly made that experience negative versus it was just negative. That's where your goal is.
I really appreciate that insight from everybody. And I think another very straightforward, immediately actionable takeaway here. Yeah, if you're not sending surveys or asking candidates about their experience, that's an easy place to start. How do we balance years of experience and education in a specific industry or function versus competency? And are there roles or functions where you can flex on experience versus potential more than others? Brittany, would you like to start us off here?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll say as somebody who directly is, I am in my role because somebody took a chance on me based off of my experience, but mostly because of my competencies. I think it's so important to make sure that you are allowing candidates to show you what they can do and allowing the opportunity to take a chance on candidates who are advocating for themselves, who have the core experience and skills that you're looking for. Like I mentioned, like you actually mentioned, I have a background in sales and I'm now a recruiter, and those skills are very, very similar, but I'm now in the tech industry. And before that, I was in the education and travel industry. And so I really had to say, like, I know I haven't done tech, I don't know software, but here's what I know. I know how to pipeline. I know how to recruit. I know how to connect with stakeholders. And that is what you need for this position and in this role. And so I can not advocate enough for finding a really strong balance and being okay with having somebody that maybe doesn't have that direct industry experience, but has the competencies, has the skills, and being willing to take a chance on candidates. I think it's oftentimes easier for folks who are earlier or mid-career to be able to take that chance. Like, you don't want a head of engineering who has no engineering experience. That might be a little bit messy, but for the most part, you're able to really allow for candidates to show what they can do. Because again, interviews are all about potential. And sometimes you can get a little bit more with skills assessments or presentations and having them do a bit of an example of their work. But sometimes you can't do that in an interview, or it's not the right role for that. And so it's really being able to know that it's okay to take a chance, especially if you're seeing enough in that interview to show that they have the ability to do the work that you want them to.
Brittany, I think that's a really good call out with your own experience. I think that's great. I would just say, like, I think we have to first acknowledge that experience, with all my talk about competencies, experience is important as a baseline for screening candidates. But as Brittany just mentioned, there are different angles from which to look at experience. And I agree with you, Brittany, it depends on the function, it depends on the level. I think you're exactly right. When it comes to hard skills versus soft skills, I think with hard skills, you're going to lean a little bit more on experience. So you probably experience this, Brittany, on a day-to-day in tech is, if you're looking for somebody who needs Python scripting experience, that's kind of a requirement. You can't kind of just walk in to a lead, scripting automation role, having never touched a scripting language or only like tangentially in a previous role. Those things matter. But when it comes to those soft skills, we're talking about sales and recruiting, let's say the competencies grit, there's potential there that you're trying to measure. And that can be more uncovered with a competency-based kind of situation or behavioral question, or like you said, Brittany, a presentation where you're really seeing what that person can do in real time. But when I think it comes to level, I think we do, for better or worse, need to lean on experience a little bit more. When we talk about people managers, not necessarily talk about leaders, that's different from a manager, but a people manager needs experience as an individual contributor, I think both for credibility and legitimacy to their team, but also practically to effectively direct the team in a certain situation. I think that goes for functional managers too. I think they need certain levels of experience in certain areas, as they'll be given a certain level of responsibility for certain projects that they'll direct. So like if it's a really high risk project that you're hiring for in your organization, they probably need to have demonstrated success in the past because it's a high risk kind of a situation. But I think what Brittany's saying here, like be careful when you're looking for experience in a specific industry or a specific company, because I think, let's say you're hiring for like a finance manager. Why does it matter? You got to ask yourself, like, why does it matter for this role in your organization if the new finance manager spent 5 years at an established financial services firm versus a startup fintech company? Like, what value does one have over the other? And so you may even find, if you're trying to hire from, let's say, the established financial services firm, some pretty homogenous candidate pools that you're drawing from. And so I think you need to unpack why you prefer to see some candidates from one industry or company over the other. And see if those reasons, like in Brittany's situation, link back to a competency. Like those skills that Brittany's talking about in sales carry over quite well to recruiting, as we know. So if that's the case, it may be best to lean on that competency to assess fit over certain like hard experience from specific industry, specific company. Because you might have 5 candidates that come from the same industry or function, but only one of them truly exhibits the competency you want. And then you may also be missing candidates from other industries or companies that exhibit stronger levels of that competency still. So when we think about culture, if we think about fit, if that's what it comes down to, you need to ask yourself, like, how is this person going to add to our team in terms of our gap in terms of skills, but also gaps in terms of culture as well.
I appreciate that insight from everybody. And then one last question before we open it up to the audience. And Michelle, we'll ask you to get started on this one. How does an individual's self-perception impact the roles that they interview for or get considered for in the first place?
Well, it starts with their lens. And what I mean by that is everyone has an individual lens that makes up who they are. And that comes from how they grew up, that comes from the friends they had, it comes from coaches, teachers, news, social media, whatever the case may be, makes up this lens that is who you are. Now, on this panel, we have several different lenses that allows for these beautiful conversations to take place. And then we hold each other accountable for things. And then we say, oh, I remember that. And we bring out the best in each other based on our lens. The thing that I want to point out about that lens is everyone walks in with a primary and secondary dimension. And without getting too deep, your primary dimension is how you walk into a room, no matter what's going on. You walk into a room with this primary dimension. Your secondary dimension is typically sometimes maybe how you want to show up, but it's not necessarily how you're able to show up. And I'll give you an example. I'm a mother of 4 that range from 3 to 21. I know I was really smart with that. And that's just my biggest, when people say, what's your most proud accomplishment? And it's my kids, it's my family. That's where it is. All of the certificates and the licenses and the degrees and the education and all of that just gets pushed to the side when it comes to my kids and my family. But that's not how I walk into a room. Prior to me telling you this, you may not have known that I've had kids. So although I wish that was my primary dimension, it's not how I get to walk in the room. I don't know how to walk into a room without being, number one, Black, and number 2, a woman. And that's how I walk into a room as a Black woman. It's not that I don't want to walk into a room as a Black woman. I just don't know how not to, because that's who I present. That's who you're going to see, regardless of whatever comes next. Don't let that negate your interactions. Don't let that negate what I really bring to the table. So that's the first thing that I want to point out. Get familiar with the people that you're close to. If you don't know what their primary dimension is, or if you're assuming what it is and you're not quite sure, confirm it. I promise you, that'll be a conversation that you won't regret having. And come from a place of curiosity. Share yours first. And I think that brings a level of self into the conversation and allow space for the other person or other individuals you're having conversations with.
Good.
And it's quick and easy.
A theme of a lot of the feedback that everybody is sharing here, a lot of these tools are really quick and easy to do if you're proactive about doing so. Okay, so we'll open it up to questions from everybody that is attending, and we've got one from Vanessa here right at the top. Can you speak more about how to redirect bias during the interview debrief meetings, perhaps designating a rotating bias interrupter role where someone is tasked with speaking up when bias creeps up, or other ideas to check ourselves during the group decision meetings, especially those spaces that are typically fairly homogeneous, maybe questions to ask? I think a good question about how everybody handles the interview debriefs.
Yeah, I'll start us off. I think this goes back to what Nick said about having questions that are around the core competencies of the role and what you're looking for, because if and when bias does come up in a debrief, you can go back to, is this what we actually need for somebody in this position to be able to do? Is this part of the day-to-day of their role? Is this connected to their job? And just making sure that you continue to lean back into, will what you're saying affect how this candidate shows up as an employee? Because that's how you can, in my opinion, that's how you can mitigate some of that bias, is making sure that it's not somebody's own personal thoughts about how a candidate shows up. For example, I've seen it happen where a candidate had to do their interview in like a more public space, and that's just because they had a lot of folks in their home and their environment wasn't, accessible to having a private space. And an interviewer brought that up and it was like, oh, that's not professional. But that is not going to impact how a person shows up as an employee and is able to do their work. And so leaning back on the actual questions and the job description is something that I always try to do.
It's great feedback, Brittany. We've got another question here. What are some examples of inherently charged or biased language that interviewers or job description authors should avoid?
I'll go ahead and jump in, Patrick, but I think some examples, I'll have to see if we can dig up some sample websites or resources for our audience. Patrick, we could maybe send afterwards, but there are resources out there to, when you're putting together a job description or when you're putting together your questions that you're going to ask. I think I used a situation of you have somebody who's interviewing for a sales representative role, and you're using words like crushed, using words like grind, very masculine words, and you can, that would be an example of words that you want to avoid for a sales role. I think when we think about function, sometimes we get biased in terms of, you know, as Michelle was saying, when you visualize a certain person for a certain role, you already have that image in your head. You know, in HR, it might be a woman, and in sales, it might be a man, or people who identify thereof. And you have to be careful when you're putting together those job descriptions or putting together those questions, that you are taking a conscious effort to try to extract those words, or use as neutral words as possible. I'm sorry, I'm really bad on the spot. I know you're looking for specific examples, but we could probably send those afterwards. But yeah, Michelle, Brittany.
What I was also going to add here is that I think it's hard for us to be able to say, like, this is the exact language. And that's why there are so many tools that do this work for us, because our perspective is once again limited by our own experiences and biases. And so I think it's important, if you can afford to have those resources. I know one that our company uses is Data People. Then that's a really great way to know that you're calling out any language and eliminating that bias there.
One thing that I would add, I thank you, Brittany, because not everyone has the resources to outsource some of these things. But one thing that is again, we're giving you the cheat sheet, the cheat code, if you will, to a lot of these things. And not to say that this isn't hard work, but this is to help you work smarter and not harder when you can. There's times when you can't cut corners, but the ableist language should be something, and this is something that you can, if you're not familiar with the term, you can look it up, but I'll give you some examples. Let's hit the ground running. Let's jump into this. And these are probably not the best examples, but ableist language is going to be something that's very easy to uncover, especially if you're familiar with it, but easy to overlook when you're not. So get familiar with the definition, and there's tons of examples out there, but that's something that you can eliminate from job descriptions, from communication. And it's very hard. I don't want people walking around not being able to communicate and be worried about what's coming out of their mouths. But if it's specifically something that you are specific to job descriptions, this is why it's important to have diverse backgrounds around, because there may be someone that doesn't necessarily have the title, doesn't necessarily have the academia or the expertise from a certification perspective, but they have the knowledge. Letting them take a look at that and finding out who those people are early on, using them to your advantage, or giving them the ability to go have time or take time to increase that knowledge until you're able to outsource. Or maybe you don't have to now because you have that expertise inside your organization ready to be used, but it's not.
One quick thing I'll add, Michelle, because you said not to worry about language, is like, I think people should try as much as you can not to operate from a sense of fear, and operate from a sense of curiosity and learning and humility, because this work is hard. It is not easy, but it's important. And I think as long as you are, you have a strong intent to do it as best as you can, and know that you will constantly learn. I am learning on this call as well. Then that is the priority in moving forward in these kinds of discussions and processes.
Completely agree.
That's really, really great feedback from everybody, as we have grown to expect. So we'll conclude things here, and just want to thank everybody again for spending the time to not only join, and of course thank our panelists, Michelle, Nick, and Brittany, for joining. We will send everybody a survey, a link to the recording, and a copy of these slides after this webinar, probably on Monday. Please don't forget to check out Halo's YouTube channel for past events, including the Halo series, where we feature thought leaders in one-on-one settings as they discuss what keeps them up at night. And thank you again to everyone that attended.